Well, good afternoon, young people. There's probably a few of you know me, but there's probably a lot who don't know me. And it's true, I do come from Queensland, but you've put on some great weather for us today. Fantastic weather. It's very much like Brisbane in the winter. So lovely to be here. Thanks for all the smiling faces. And it's really a great opportunity to come and talk to you about the things in Daniel 4 and 5. Like most studies, when you start off, you sort of got a few ideas you think about what it's about, but when you actually get into it, it's amazing what the scriptures have and how relevant they are. When I look at on a crowd of young people here, it's amazing. I don't know how many are here, but there's quite a few. And you cast yourself back to the time of Daniel, and he had 3 friends. That's all he had, 3 friends that he could rely on, who loved the things of God and were prepared to put their life on the line for that. 3. And you've got an amazing group of young people here, prepared to let go their Saturday and come here and learn about the Word of God. I want just go back to Kings. Have a look at Kings in the record there. Just want to see this because I think this is something that's really important for us to understand, and I think this is one of the big lessons that comes out of the story of Daniel. It's probably a bit of a white elephant sometimes amongst us, but in 2 Kings 24, we read of one of the ways of the captivities. So 2 Kings 24 says in verse 13, "And he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon king of Israel had made in the temple of Yahweh, as Yahweh had said. And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes and all the mighty men of valour, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. And he carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, and the king's mother and the king's wives and his officers and the mighty of the land. Those carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And all the men of might, even 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths 1,000, all that was strong and apt for war, even them the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon." So, in a cursory reading of that, there's possibly at least 18,000 people who were taken captive in that wave alone. 18,000. And these were all the people of the king's palace, the mighty men, the men of renown in Israel. When we get to Babylon, there's 4 faithful Jews. 4. So, the lesson that comes out for us young people particularly is that you in your community, and it doesn't mean that anyone here can be excluded from this. We can all be part of that little group of 4. But you need to find out in your group of young people, your friends that are prepared to lay down their life for the truth. We haven't had to do that yet. We haven't had any persecution at all, really, have we? But you need to sort out whether your friends are really lovers of God, or they rest on their laurels and we're just part of a community, a Christadelphian family for 3 or 4 generations, or belong to a big ecclesia. I don't have to tell you, young people, that as a group of believers, we're all angels. We're not that, are we? And to a great degree, we have adopted a lot of worldly practices and ideas and attitudes. And so the theme that the suburban group have put together this year is fantastic, the tale of 2 kingdoms. There's a choice that we have to make when there's 2 kingdoms, one or the other, and only one will be supreme. You know that from Daniel chapter 2 that you've done. And those 2 kingdoms have existed from the very beginning of time. From Genesis to Revelation, we find those 2 kingdoms. And those 2 kingdoms are hostile to each other. Genesis 3:15, what does it say? Right from the very beginning, about the serpent's thinking. God said, "I will put enmity between that sort of thinking and my thinking." So the hostility that's there between those 2 ideas are actually being put there by God himself. So it can never be removed. So the moment, young people, you choose either of those kingdoms, you're going to find yourself antagonistic to the other. That there's going to be hostility, there's going to be warfare between those two things. And I wonder sometimes, when we live in the age in which we do, that it's because there's a lack of no physical persecution, that we can float along and we can actually be part of a great, wonderful social group of people and yet not really be committed to God. And what I'm saying is, if there was a fiery furnace out there on the Oval, would we still be where we are today? The ecclesia at Smyrna, an ecclesia that had no problems in their ecclesia. They were positive, they were going, they had no condemnations given to them because they were under such physical persecution that you were for God 100% or you left the meeting. There was no floating along. And it was a simple case of just worshipping Caesar, just a pinch of incense. Just had to walk up to the shrine and go, Caesar is God, and walk off. Just a pinch of incense, and then you were safe for the whole year. But they knew that if they did that, they'd swap sides in their allegiances. And so that little ecclesia, there was no condemnation there. They were all for the truth, 100%. So I wonder sometimes, and I grew up the same. I've never felt physical persecution that other generations have. So I understand how you feel, young people. We haven't had to stand up for the truth with our life, have we? But Daniel did. His 3 friends did. And that's the challenge, isn't it? And the decisions that we make about which kingdom we belong to is actually a life and death decision that we make. And we can talk about the world outside and the ecclesia, but we know that's not really where the battle is. The battle's in your own mind, in our own individual minds. That's where the battle is of which kingdom we're going to serve. There's an amazing quote from Napoleon, and this outlines exactly what I'm saying. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne and myself have founded great empires, but upon what did these creations of our genius depend? Upon force. This is the kingdom of Babylon that we're looking at. That's what they set up. Jesus alone founded his empire upon love, and to this very day millions will die for him. Jesus Christ was more than a man. So when you can dominate people by force, there's not much power in that really, is there? But when someone can dominate you and control you for your own benefit because of love, that's unstoppable. And this is Napoleon who says this. He says he was more than a man. He was divine. He taught the things of God, which had a power to change your life. And what we see in Daniel chapter 4 tonight is the very fact that Nebuchadnezzar had a life-changing experience that changed his life forever. You think about that. He was a pagan king. And as the record stands, there's no doubt in my mind that he'll be in the kingdom. His declaration, his understanding of who God was and who he was flawless. And he was a pagan king because he learnt the most fundamental lesson that we all have to learn when we want God to work in our life. You started off in Daniel chapter 1. I have followed your sessions on YouTube. But you have a look in Daniel chapter 1, and you've probably been through this. But the way that Babylon decided to control people. In Daniel chapter 1 verse 4, the king took people who had no blemish. They were upright and they were clean. They were well favoured. They were skillful in all wisdom. They were cunning in knowledge. They had application. They had the ability to stand in the king's palace. And they wanted to teach them the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So this is the origin of universities, isn't it? We can educate them in our ways. And Daniel found himself, didn't he? He found himself in a world that you find yourselves in. I find myself in. Universities are part of our life now. Probably for most of your occupations, university is an essential part. But Daniel found himself. And of course, all of those things, the learning and the motivation of universities is all founded and driven by pride and ambition, prosperity, status. Verse 5, and if you're in this group of people, you can eat from the king's meat. And at the king's table, there was privilege, there was status involved. You remember what he did back in Israel when he took the people out? He took all the mighty people, all the skillful people, but all the poor people he left behind. We're going to see that coming back. That little idea will come back to us at the end of our study this evening or this afternoon. So we find ourselves in a world where that idea is promoted. The world thrives on it. Advertising lives on the fact that people want more. We're self-centered. We're looking for self-satisfaction. And the advertising world knows that, and they appeal to that. And it works because we all are driven by that. So we need to sort of make this decision in our life, don't we? We live in this world. We have to work in this world. But we have to draw the line that where it crosses the things of God, we've got to stand aside. You have a look at what it says in verse 8. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And of course, as you know, that was a life and death situation. If you come before the king and you don't look healthy and well, that's it, you are finished. And Daniel said, I trust in my God, and I'm going to take that decision. And so he purposed in his heart that system of Babylon would not overtake his thinking and his love of the things of God. And that was an enormous challenge. They said, we only know of 4 people who took that challenge up. Out of how many thousands, we don't know. In our reading just yesterday, Joshua 7, have a look at that. It was about the taking of Jericho and Achan. This was the occasion where the kingdom of God was going to be established on the earth for the very first time. In the nation of Israel, they would be representatives of the kingdom of God on earth. And Solomon ruled over that kingdom some years later. So they were entering the land to be established in the promised land that he was given to Abraham, that was promised to Abraham, their father. And at that very same time, Achan puts his hand out. And what does he take? He takes a Babylonian garment, silver and gold. He took of the accursed thing. So right at the very moment in time when the kingdom of God was going to be established for the first time, there was the antagonistic party. Verse 21. I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonian garment and 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels in weight, and I coveted them and I took them. And behold, they are hid in the earth in the midst of my tent. What was he going to do with those things in Israel? What good would a Babylonian garment do Achan in Israel? Well, he obviously had intent to have another life outside of the ecclesia, didn't he? I mean, you wouldn't wear a Babylonian garment to a service or to a feast of Yahweh when you were the only one with one. Unless you were totally proud and arrogant and didn't care about God. And yet God, in his love and his mercy, gives him opportunity after opportunity as the tribes were separated, the families were separated, and narrowed it down. And he gave opportunity to Achan to confess. And it came, of course, to the last chance. And it was only when he was pointed out that he confessed. So we all need to realise that this decision is in our own mind. We as individuals need to make the decision who we choose to serve, the kingdom of Babylon or the kingdom of God. And so challenges, the book of Daniel actually gives us lots and lots of challenges, young people. You've seen some already. We're talking about the eating of the king's meat, partaking of the fantastic things of this world as part of well, it's not really a blessing, but it's part of sort of like an end result of being involved in their systems. We're going to read that in the next chapter as well. These two chapters are very much linked together, as we'll see. We saw the challenge, of course, of the fiery furnace. Bow down to this idol or die. Now I'm going to tell you a little story that I had, an experience I had, it lives in my memory as one of the most inspiring times of my life in the truth. We're in the centre of Brisbane, near the City Hall, and there was a big group gathered. There was hundreds and hundreds of people gathered. And it was some sort of Christian presentation. And my wife and I were there, and we'd listened to this. It was the most woeful stuff you've ever heard. It was very typical Christian, not much Bible in it at all. And then, after about 5 or 10 minutes, the presenter asked everybody to pray, as he was going to pray about the things he'd spoken about. Well, everyone bowed down, except my wife and I, and there was another person across the other side of the crowd. And he was a friend of mine from the meeting. And to this day, that is etched on my memory, that there was a person, and we looked pretty stupid, believe me. I felt like I looked stupid. Well, I probably do anyway, but I felt really awkward. But the fact that I saw that person stand up and say, no, I'm not going to bow down to this, completely lifted my spirit. I've never forgotten that. And I didn't know he was there, and he didn't know we were here. We were there. So that's the sort of challenges that we have. Are we going to bow down to take the things of this world, to save our life, to increase our status, our prosperity, or whatever? So there's lots of challenges in this book, and what we're going to do in chapter 4 is look at all the challenges that Nebuchadnezzar actually presents to us. And as I said, probably the most important thing is this fundamental foundation that we're going to learn about godliness. It's the essential principle that will change our lives forever. And young people, that is the challenge, isn't it, too? Change. We can know things aren't doing, in our own life aren't going right. We can recognise that. We can talk to each other about that. But actually make changes to improve that situation is really tough, isn't it? It's tough for me. And it's really tough for young people if all their peers aren't prepared to make the changes that we need to make. So we all have a responsibility to each other to help make those changes. There's a repeated phrase in this chapter. You probably picked it up when you did the reading. Verse 17. I want you to highlight it in your Bible some way, whichever way you'd like to highlight it. Verse 17. At the end of the verse, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. And in verse 25, 7 times would pass over him until he knew that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will. At the end of verse 26, after thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. Verse 32, until thou know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. I'll put them up on the screen for you if you want to have a look at them. And of course, one more in the chapter that we're going to deal with tonight, where Daniel repeats and gives us a resume of chapter 4 and the lessons. And he says at the end of verse 21, till he knew that the Most High ruled in the kingdom of men and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. So in these 2 chapters, 4 times it's mentioned this principle of or the purpose of this whole event was to teach Nebuchadnezzar that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he wills. So the very purpose of these dramatic events was to do that. And we probably acknowledge that, don't we? We know that God rules in the kingdoms of the world and the kingdom of men. But what will our life look like if we really believe that? That's the question, isn't it? We might say, yeah, we believe God rules in the kingdom of men. But what will our life look like if we truly believe it? And that's what Nebuchadnezzar presents for us in this chapter. What someone will look like when they truly believe that. So this chapter 4, it's written in past tense, isn't it? And Nebuchadnezzar reflects on those events that happened in his life. So when we say that he had a life-changing experience, that was real. That wasn't something that was momentary and gone. This was something that he could reflect upon and hang on to. At least 12 months later, he could look back and go, this is still the way I feel about that event. It was wonderful. So his change of heart is a challenge for us, of course, as individuals to follow. So the first challenge is in verse 1. Have a look at this. Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God has wrought toward me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom and his dominion is from generation to generation. What a change. What a change had come over this king. Now, as far as who this Nebuchadnezzar really was, it's always difficult to determine which one he was. And I don't think the scriptures actually outline the particular kings, because the principle applies to a rulership over this whole empire. And no matter who the king actually was, the spirit was the same. The Nebuchadnezzar had the same spirit, the same attitudes. And all the rulers of Babylon share that same feeling. But what happens now in this verse 1, he says he wants all people, nations, languages that dwell on the earth, he says, peace be multiplied unto you. The knowledge of God had a life-changing impact on his life. And I want you to think about it. I want you to write these things down as we go. I want you to think about these things. Has the knowledge of God had a life-changing impact on your life, on my life? I want you to write these things down and actually think about them. Talk to each other about these things. We're here this afternoon. Let's make the most of it. Let's really make this a life-changing experience. Let's feel like Nebuchadnezzar felt. He wanted to tell everyone. That's the next challenge, isn't it? How keen am I to tell everyone about my belief in God? There was no holding back. He wanted everyone to know this. He wasn't shy about it. He wasn't embarrassed about it. He didn't care telling about the Amorites he didn't care if it was the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Persians. He didn't care. He wanted to tell everybody. Everybody. There was no holding back. How often do we feel like that? That the truth has made such an impact on my life that I've got to tell everyone I meet. The Apostle Paul did, didn't he? And he could say that I'm not guilty of the blood of any man. In other words, there isn't a person who met me who didn't know my belief and my passion for God. This is a pagan king, young people. He didn't grow up in a Christadelphian family and a nice ecclesia where he could learn about the things of God. He went through a horrible experience. And out of that, he learned the lesson that will change our life and allow God to work with us. We're going to come to that. So there's 2 challenges already. Are we prepared to tell everybody? Are we so excited about the things that we know. And he says, peace be multiplied unto you. He now knew the source of peace. I mean, he was the king of Babylon. He had everything he wanted. He couldn't do with any more money. He had all the money, all the gold he wanted. He had servants, whatever he wanted, he had. But he now reaches out to the world and he says, peace be multiplied. I know what peace is now. It's the peace that Daniel had, and we'll come to that shortly. The peace that he had in his life. So the ups and downs and the turmoils and the troubles of life. Nebuchadnezzar said, I've found that peace. And I want to give it to you. All of you, he says, I want to give it to you. Is that how you feel in your life when you talk to people? When we talk to people in the world? And when we talk about the people in the world, our work colleagues, university colleagues, fellow students, whatever it might be, do we often sit down and pray for peace upon them? They live in a terrible world. You know the world. You live in the same world, but you have the resources to see it from a different point of view. They don't. And when Nebuchadnezzar, his eyes were changed and he saw it from God's point of view, he turned around and he said, I want you all to know this peace. I want to share it with you. There is nothing like it. Is that the way we approach our friends? Is that the way we feel about the knowledge of the truth that we had? He goes on to say in verse 2, I thought it good to show the signs and the wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. I want you to highlight those two words, toward me. Wow, here's another challenge, isn't it? Toward me. List down the amazing things God has done for me, for you. How many can you write down? Reflect on your life and you personally. How much has God done for you that proves his existence, his love, his care for you, whatever it might be about God? Write down. How many can you write down? List the things where God has touched your life. Again, this is a pagan king and he said, I want to tell the world what's God done toward me. Not toward us as Christadelphians, but towards me as a person. So when you're talking to someone about the truth, you can say, I tell you what God's done for me and he's changed my life because of this and because of this. And I used to think this, but I don't now because of this. Or do we often say, oh, well, we don't believe in the devil and we believe that Jesus Christ will come back and we don't believe in the Trinity? That's not how you preach the truth. You preach the truth, young people, by telling people the wonders and the signs that God has done for you. For you personally. And then your friends will start, well, really? It means so much more to people when you express to them your experience, your personal experience with God. And Nebuchadnezzar knew that. He was reaching out. You know, like I say, he was the king of Babylon. He could have made a decree, but he didn't. I want to tell you about God. He's touched my life. He's changed me forever. And I want to share that experience with you. It really struck me. I never saw these things when I first looked at the chapter, but going through, you see how Nebuchadnezzar's mind was being moved here by the experiences that he went through. You have a look at verse 3. What an amazing description that he has of God. He says, for great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. The Nebuchadnezzar of the previous chapter thought he was going to live forever. Let's make a golden image from top to bottom. I'm not going to pass away. But he now says, no, I'm going to go and another generation is going to come. And the same God will be the same God who will rule over that generation. And the one after that. And the one after that. Because he's everlasting. You know, do we personally see God in these sorts of ideas, these words, these thoughts? That when we speak to God in our prayers and our private times, do we sort of express our understanding of how mighty God is? That his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. We grapple with that, do we? That this kingdom will never have an end. His dominion is from generation to generation. He knows no restrictions, no time barriers. That's the God that we worship. It's touched our life, young people. Touched our lives. This great and mighty God. And Nebuchadnezzar is showing that this can change our life. And these are the things that need to change. This is the words and the thoughts of a person who believes that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. A man who grew up and reigned over the kingdom of men, but made a choice to be part of the kingdom of God. And that's the choice that we all need to make. So what happens in verse 4? He says, he was at rest in mine house and he was flourishing in his palace. Well, he's the goal of the world, isn't it? To be prosperous, as the idea of the word is. That's what the world says. That's what it's all about, to be prosperous, isn't it? To be able to wake up and afford to be able to do whatever you want every day of your life. Is that right? That's the goal. Is that the goal of our life? What are we really aiming for in our life? Is that what we're aiming for in the choices that we make? Are we aiming for present prosperity? My suggestion would be that's probably what most of us are aiming for. It feels good, it sounds good, doesn't it? But what happens when we become prosperous? What's the problem with being prosperous? Well, there's a couple of quotes I want to have a look at. We're going to go to Proverbs 30 on the way back to Deuteronomy. Let's go to Proverbs 30. And it very clearly states for us the problems. Proverbs 30, verse 7 to 9, he says, two things have I required of thee. Deny me them not before I die. He says, remove far from me vanity and lies. So I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't want to have a foot in both kingdoms. I want to be genuine. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food sufficient for the day. Lest I be full, lest I be self-sufficient, lest I be prosperous, and I deny thee and say, who is Yahweh? Or lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain. So there's a danger in prosperity and there's a danger in being so poor that you can't see where your next meal's coming from. And yet God has promised he will always be with the poor to provide for them. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 8 and the warning that Moses gave Israel as they entered the promised land. And this is really probably very telling for us because we live in a pretty prosperous generation. He says, when, verse 7, for Yahweh your God, when he brings you into a good land, a land of brooks of waters, of fountains and depths, and springs out of the valley and hills, a land of wheat and barley, he says, the danger is, verse 10, when thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless Yahweh thy God for the good land which he hath given you. Beware, he says, that thou forget not Yahweh thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold be multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget Yahweh thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led thee through the wilderness, through fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, who fed thee in the wilderness. He went through all these difficult things for you to do you good at your latter end, at the end of verse 16. So he says, I know what's going to happen to you. You're going to get to the land and everything's going to go well for you and God's going to bless you. And you're going to go, I don't need God anymore. And that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did in chapter 4. He had this warning 12 months ahead. And 12 months later, he's full of pride and self-satisfaction. So, beware of this prosperity. So God, what he wants to do, he wants to actually get us to a situation where we are dependent upon him. So we really realise that we don't know. We say God willing, and we believe that. We don't know how we're going to be provided for in the future, but we rely upon God. We haven't got $50 million in the bank to know, well, I'm safe, I can do what I'm right. We've got enough to live day by day, and so each day we pray for our daily bread. That's the ideal position, isn't it? But you know, we don't want to be there. We don't want to be there, young people. Do you want to be there? Every day you pray for your bread for the next day? And have the faith that God will provide it? And yet God took Israel through the wilderness to learn that very lesson. You know, when they were in Egypt, they were just as dependent upon God. Just as dependent upon God. The difference was they didn't see it. And it's the difference between living in a city where you've got Woolworths, Coles, Aldi, and you live at Oodnadatta, where the only veggies and meat you're going to get is what you get out of your backyard. And there's a drought or there's a flood. And you soon realise, wow, we're really dependent upon God. And living in the city, it sort of softens that, doesn't it? We can't get tomatoes from South Australia, we get them from Brazil. They'll still be in Woolies. And the whole world is focused on trying to remove that need for dependence upon God. And it's working. And we don't see that in our life, do we? We better move forwards. So, we've got to realise that the power of prosperity that has the ability to push God out of our lives, we have to be very careful with it. Very careful with it. And remember, of course, that if we are prosperous, it's God who's put us in that position, and it's his wealth, it's his prosperity that he's given to us to share and to look after. Okay, what happens? He has this dream, and what does he do? First thing he turns to the wisdom of the world, doesn't he? Verse 6 and verse 7 of Daniel chapter 4. He sought the wisdom of this world first. And of course, there was no answer in that. But at last Daniel came in before me, verse 8, whose name was Belshazzar, according to the name of my God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and before him I told the dream, saying, O Belshazzar. Do some of the events in our life disturb us like they disturbed Nebuchadnezzar? And when we get in that position, where do we turn? You know, some of the experiences we might have are terrifying. We feel really afraid. We feel alone sometimes. We don't know where to turn. But where do we turn for personal advice? Nebuchadnezzar turned to his wise men, the ones that he trained in his wisdom and his learning. Those who would be the hierarchy, the leading lights in his community. And on the big issues of life, they had no answers. And then he turns to Daniel. Of course, he was a man who was faithful to God and an understanding of the truth and who the living God really was. And he said, you know, Daniel, I look at you and nothing troubles you. Nothing troubles you. In all the experiences of your life, in the ups and downs, facing death, taking seemingly ridiculous risks for God, nothing phases you, Daniel. What is it? It's because he believed that God rules in the kingdoms of men. He believed that wholeheartedly, and his life showed that. He wasn't afraid of all the difficult things in life, the experiences he might go through, because he knew that God was with him in all of those experiences, no matter how horrible they have been. And we need to be certain of that, young people, that no matter what experiences we've been through in our life, God was there. And the moment we think that God wasn't there is the moment our life falls apart. And sometimes we don't have explanations for those things, and we've got to learn and reach out to God to give us strength. And to see the same things that the world sees as terrible and horrible in a different light, as stepping stones to a development in our character. So Daniel was a strong, faithful man because he had this hope in him. So you just imagine, how does our profile compare to Daniel's? He had the spirit of the holy gods, and no secret troubled him. It's probably something that we really need to think about. We've probably talked about a lot, but it's one of those things, again, where we don't find much change happens. How does our profile match up with Daniel's, young people? Not just young people, all of us. You know, this is how the world saw Daniel. How do you see yourself? How do you want others to see you? What's your Facebook profile or your avatar or whatever you might, your online persona, whatever it might be? What is it? Does it line up with Daniel? We're going to see in the next chapter like a complete profile of Daniel, like the full do tonight. You're going to see exactly what Daniel was. But here's just a little prelude. Honestly, how do you present yourself? What's your profile look like? Does it read something like that? That I am a keen Bible student. My whole life is about learning about God and waiting for the kingdom to come. Is that, I don't know, is that what it is? If it is, that's fantastic. But if it isn't, young people, are we going to make the effort to change that? That's what we're learning about Daniel. That's why we come here to think about these things, to make those changes. Nebuchadnezzar was a proud, arrogant, pagan king, and he became a humble, devoted servant to God. Now, I can't even imagine how great that change was. So, we can all go home tonight and relook at our profiles. So if someone's in a bit of spot of trouble, they can look up and go, he's a guy, he really wants to get his head in the Bible. That's what I want to be. I'll connect with this guy or that girl. Let's connect with them and let's see whether they can help me out through this, because I'm struggling. And we all struggle. You live in a crazy world, young people. A world that I don't fully understand. I honestly don't. And I feel for you, because it's a cruel world that just burns you up and spits you out. And I don't care one thing for you. They just want to consume you. And we need help. All of us need help. But we want to reach out and touch other people that are struggling and know that the only way is through the things of God. Here was Daniel. So Nebuchadnezzar goes through all his wise men. And they were pretty smart, these guys. They know more about maths than we know now. They were intelligent people. But on the issues of life, they had no idea. So that's something for us to think about, isn't it? How do people know us? How do people see us? How do we want to present ourselves? Okay, let's get into this. The Babylonian tree. It's really easy because both these chapters, we're given the explanation, so we're not stuck in all sorts of wild ideas. It's pretty simple. A tree grows up, and all the beasts of the field shadow under it. They dwell under it. And of course, we know from the next chapter that God gave Babylon this kingdom. He gave them the tree. He established that. He let all the nations come, and it was God's work throughout the whole thing, that the nations that came to serve Babylon were at the hand of God. God brought them there. You might want to jot down something in the margin, Jeremiah 27, verse 5 to 8. So here was this tree that represented Nebuchadnezzar. So here it was, beautiful, fruitful tree. All sorts of animals came there. It was a fantastic place of shelter, wonder. And it says that this watcher, the angel, of course, that God has watchers on every part of the world, doesn't he? He sees, he rules in the kingdom of men. These are all his angels that are working at every moment throughout the world. He says, cut the tree down, take off its branches. and leave the stump of his roots in the earth with a band of iron and brass, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his heart be changed from a man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him, until he knows that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. So this is what happens. The tree gets cut down. This mighty tree that everyone's sheltered under. It's just left a stump in the ground. There's a band of brass and iron on it. It's wet with the dew of heaven. To the intent, and we're going to pick up the stump tonight in tonight's study because it links in really well with chapter 5. To the intent, or to the purpose, to the end. The reason this happened was that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and sets up over it the basest of men. And it repeats in verse 18, none of the wise men could make sense of this, Daniel. And then Daniel picks it up. He was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. He was an absolute wreck. Now, we just read in verse 9 that nothing troubled him. So what's the difference here? What happened to Daniel in verse 19? He was astonished, and his thoughts troubled him. What was the problem? He was Daniel who was unfazable. Nothing happened. He could deal with all sorts of things. He was concerned for Nebuchadnezzar. Even though he was a pagan king, he still saw him as a possible convert. And he saw the dream and he understood the meaning. He thought, what troubles me, king, is that this vision is against you. It's bringing horrible things upon you, and all your enemies are going to rejoice at this. And that hurts me. So there's a couple of things that come out of that, isn't it? You think about that. He was concerned for Nebuchadnezzar. He was really concerned. And when we talk to people in the world and we know the judgments that God is going to bring upon this world, how do we approach people? In a callous, cold way, with a great, powerful description of the doom that's going to come upon them? Or do we say, you know what? God's offering us a chance to escape all that. There's hard times coming, but you don't have to succumb to those things. You don't have to feel the pressure and give up on that. I got something exciting. God's changed my life forever. I want to share that with you. It's not all lost. I had a brother one time, he said to me, it just horrified me. I can't wait for the time that God comes and destroys the earth and drowns them all like dirty rats. And I thought, that's not the spirit of Nebuchadnezzar, of Daniel here to Nebuchadnezzar. That's not what God wants for the world. That's what's going to happen to a lot of them. But it's not what he wants. It's not what we should want. We're to pray for peace upon the world. Reach out to them. Be concerned about the horrible things that are going to happen to this world if they don't take hold of the hope of Israel. A time of trouble such as never was. We couldn't wish that on anyone. And that should give us the impetus to try and pull them out even a little bit harder, isn't it? Come on, you can't stay where you are. It's not going to end well. And so he reaches out here. Do I feel troubled when I tell others about God's judgments coming on the world? Do we feel that? Do we feel like this feels horrible? And for people who don't understand God, who don't understand discipline, who don't understand truth and judgment, it's a hard thing for them to accept and understand that. They live in a world where you can do nothing that's bad or horrible or wrong or nasty or... Understand it. And when you reach out, come from that point of view. You feel really awkward and troubled to express the way God feels about the iniquity in the world around us. And so he goes on to say to the king, what's going to happen to you, king? What a horrible thing that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Great hairy creature he grew into with big long claws, hair like feathers, out in the field for 7 times. And yet from that experience, young people, he found God. And I was saying to you earlier on, when we go through tough times and difficult times in our life, we've got to take Daniel's view and Nebuchadnezzar's view. We've got to see those things as opportunities for spiritual growth. Now, that could be challenging. You think how challenging it was for Nebuchadnezzar. You're the king of the whole world. And for 7 years, you're out there like an animal in the field and everyone's laughing at you. That's the king of Babylon. Have a look at him. But he came back from that, a changed man. And that's the challenge for us all, isn't it? You know, in verse 23 of this chapter, right through to verse 27, where we see Daniel's explanation of what would happen to Nebuchadnezzar. He'd be driven from men, he would be given the heart of a beast. And, you know, that's really God's purpose, isn't it? Right from Genesis, we learnt that we are without God nothing but an animal, are we? And God gave us something that separated us from the animals, that made us extra special. And that was a mind that could absorb divine things, that could appreciate the things of heaven. And Nebuchadnezzar that was taken from him and he became a raw animal. And it's interesting, isn't it? As we get towards the end of it, he realises that when he starts to see and he looks up into the heavens and he realises the position he really is, that without God he's nothing but an animal, his understanding returns to him and his reason returns. So we come to the actual event that happened in verse 29. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the king of Babylon, and the king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom, that he, by my might and my power, and for the honour of my majesty? So here it was, 12 months ago, he was given this vision. Daniel explained to him very carefully what would happen. And he's standing there a year later and he says, Is not this great Babylon that I have builded by the might of my power for the honour of my majesty? And we come here, young people, to the most important lesson that you're ever going to learn in your life if you want God to work with you. And that is that the only living thing in this world, or even dead thing, it doesn't really matter, anything in this world, the only thing that stands in open opposition to God in this world is your heart and my heart. Every beast of the field, every bird, every flower, every seed that brings forth, every storm, every lightning bolt, everything is at the command. It just does exactly what God says. In the very beginning, God said, Let there be light, and there was light. But there's one thing that savagely refuses to listen to God, and that's the pride of man. And here was King Nebuchadnezzar. Look what I've built, this is great. Daniel had told him, this is the kingdom that God's given to you. No, I've done this. This is all my achievement. Honour me. Give me the majesty. And that's the challenge of your life and my life, young people. Pride. You think about that. How much does pride influence the choices you make? Now, these sorts of things are very difficult to determine, aren't they? They're very hard to talk to ourselves about that. But this is the big challenge of our life. If you want Lord God to rule, you've got to get rid of your pride. How much does it influence your choices? Boys, tell me. Whatever car you choose, how much does pride play a part in that? Oh, a few smiles came up straight away. All right? Because we're interested in what we care about what other people think of us. We would never, ever want to buy a wide-body Camry, would we? I mean, they're grandpa cars, man. You'd rather buy an absolute smoky bomb Hilux that ran on 3 cylinders than drive a beautiful wide-body Camry, wouldn't you? Yeah, I know. I know exactly. And you know why? It's pride. I mean, that's just a simple, dumb little thing, and girls are probably, well, I'm not going to go there, but you probably pick outfits or whatever. And, pride plays a big part in that. What is pride? It's a feeling you get when what you think other people think of you, isn't it? It's all based upon what other people think or what you perceive they think, isn't it? That's what pride is. And we need to stop when we're making those decisions and say, hey, what would God think of this decision? Because pride will always oppose God. And it's the only thing in this world. You think in Mark chapter 7, what does the Lord say? Out of the heart of man proceed all sorts of evil, adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, all sorts of sin. That's the heart of man, because we're after self. We're trying to promote self. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar was doing. This is all about me. I'm the most important person in the world. You ever heard that before? That's the challenge you have. That's the world you live in. That's the world that Daniel lived in. So human pride is an open rebellion to God. Remember old Pharaoh? Yahweh comes and let my people go. Oh, who's Yahweh? I should obey his voice. I'm not going to listen to Yahweh. Don't even know who he is. That's the obstacle we have. That's the challenge of our life. Our own pride is the ultimate obstacle letting God control our life. It's the driving force of the kingdom of men. It's what drives the whole economy. It drives capitalism. It drives all sorts of isms. It just depends where up the scale you are. But pride is there. It's about power and control and feeling good about what other people think of you. And this was Nebuchadnezzar. But you see what he does. See what happens to him in his life. Look at the end of this chapter. What a brilliant declaration. It says, the same hour, verse 33, was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men and ate grass as the oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High God, and I praised and honoured him that liveth for ever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what are you doing, God? At the same time, my reason returned unto me. He became more than an animal. He could see what life was all about. And God then on that basis restored to him his power. And verse 37 says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honour the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment. There it is, truth and judgment, the things that our world lacks. We've got a wonderful legal system, but it's hardly truthful and it's hardly judgment. It's all about lies and deception. And you know what he says at the end? He says, you know what? And he's able to abase those that walk in pride. I want you to go back in our closing thoughts to verse 27. This is what Daniel's exhortation was to the king. When he explained the vision to him, he said, you know what, king? O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee. Break off thy sins by righteousness and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility or thy peace. He says, I want you to listen to this message and change your life. He said, leave away the life of sin. Break off thy sins and change and show mercy to the poor. You remember we read in Kings when he took away all the wonderful people of the land? All the ones he thought were great and famous and would be wonderful to sit in his, that looked great, that were wise. And he said, the poor, just leave them in the land. And we get to this point, he says, you know what, king? you did the wrong thing. It was all about image and looks and prestige and power and control. He said, you know what? God doesn't work with those people, and very few of those people are called, he says. He said, you need to change your attitude and look to the poor, because they're the people who realise their dependence upon God. They're not driven by pride and ambition. They realise the enormous love of God and that without him we're nothing. So that's the challenge. Lots and lots of challenges that we're going to pick up in chapter 5. Here was Nebuchadnezzar, young people, a pagan king who made enormous changes. I'm sure that we can take some of his lessons and make some of those changes in our life as we try to live a life that's pleasing to the King of Heaven.